It's Mike Wilkerson. Who's Mike Wilkerson? Let me tell you. I'll tell you. He's the founder of Stormwall Advisors. Yes, he's the host of Stormwall.com, and he is the author of a tremendous book which I read and have raved about. We've discussed it on the program. It's Why America Matters, the Case for a New Exceptionalism. Mike Wilkerson, welcome back.
Thanks, Eric. Good to be with you.
Mike, let's talk about anything you want to talk about, but probably start with Israel.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about Israel in particular. Obviously, it's been a centerpiece for reasons that are good and bad. Terrible to see the tragedy that happened. It's been good to see the support, but now I'm increasingly concerned that it is deeply misunderstood what is happening in this part of the world and why. So specifically, one of the things that I think is being completely missed by the mainstream media, you won't hear this from governments or from anyone else, which is the religious or spiritual aspect of what is happening here. And what do I mean by that? Well, specifically, as you fully appreciate, for the Jews, for Christians, and for Muslims, Jerusalem is effectively the center of the universe. And for each of them, there's enormous significance here in what is happening. But what a lot of us don't understand, even those who do understand the Christian religious tradition or otherwise, is to appreciate just how deeply embedded is an Islamic view of the end times, an eschatology that has everything to do with what is happening here in Israel and with Jerusalem right now.
That's a big thing. Now, before we get into that, because that's huge and central, I just want to reiterate what I say throughout my life, is that we're living in this bifurcated reality. The mainstream media, including much conservative media, is secular. They do not have the ability to see the big picture. Most people don't live this way. Most people have a spiritual component. And when you're dealing with radical Islam, when you're dealing with the question of the Jews and Israel, this is inescapably connected to religion, spiritual tradition, spiritual issues, and they always seem to frame it politically, which is at least half wrong. In other words, if you're doing that when you're dealing with a religious war or a war whose perpetrators, or a horror, a nightmare, a massacre, whose perpetrators are motivated specifically by religious issues, not by political issues. But they don't go there. That's why I'm excited to talk to you about this, because it's just preposterous to try to understand this as a political issue when it's mostly something else.
Think about all of the millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, who reacted with something more than a political response following the Hamas attack. Why is that? Because deep in our heart, somewhere, if we've grown up in the faith, any of the three people of the book phase, the monotheistic phase, we have been taught, in part or in whole, something about the end times, something about how this whole thing ends. And when we see something happening, affecting Israel, affecting Jerusalem, we get twitchy intuitively because we remember that or we recall it, even if we're not up to speed on what it is exactly.
Okay, Armageddon, which everybody says, oh, Armageddon, that's the end of the world. What does Armageddon mean? Where do we get that from? Well, it's the valley of Megiddo, which is in Israel. In other words, anybody with any sense of what the Christian view of the end times would be knows that it's going down there. And so that's why we get to use your word twitchy, because when you see this kind of thing happening, you wonder, is this it?
And Jerusalem as a city, incredibly important. So for the Jews, they expect that their Messiah will come and be revealed in Jerusalem. They will see him there. Christians believe that Jesus, when he returns at his second coming in glory, will come to Jerusalem. Well,
and both of those could be simultaneously true. But the third view cannot be simultaneously true. That would be Muslim view of the end times?
So the Muslim view is that Jerusalem is also the center. Why? Because that is where the battle happens. That is where the Mahdi comes. The Mahdi is the sort of guide, the leader in Shia Islam. He is the 12th and final imam, second only in power and authority to Muhammad himself. It's also where Jesus comes back. Now, in Islam, Jesus doesn't come back the way he does the way we know he does in Christianity, in power, in glory, to establish a righteous kingdom. He comes back to tell everybody that they were wrong, that Allah is the true God and Muhammad is his prophet.
Okay, so wait. Whenever I hear something like this, I'm like, okay, pause. Let's say this again, because this is big news. According to the Muslim version of the end times, when Jesus comes back, he says, say it again, because this is headline news. He says...
He's got something to do. We'll come back to that. But what he says is that everyone who weren't paying attention, all you Jews, all you Christians, you've had it wrong this whole time. Allah is God. There's only one God. Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet.
More than I am.
More than I am. And I am subservient to Muhammad. And of
Jesus
course,
is subservient to Muhammad in the Muslim faith, and that's how they see it going down. And that cannot work with the Christian view, obviously, but that is their view. Because, you know, Mike, another headline here is that most people don't ever talk about the Muslims having an end time scenario. We talk about the Christian end time scenario, but the idea that they have this idea, which I find frightening, it's almost never talked about.
I'd like to unpack it if we can. I want to finish with one thought on what Jesus does when he comes back. And that'll set the stage for talking a little bit about what do Muslims believe about the end times. So in addition to acknowledging Allah and Muhammad, Jesus comes back to wage war against the Antichrist. Now, there's differences of views around who does the fighting, Mahdi or Jesus or both of them at different times. But Jesus comes back to destroy finally the Antichrist. Who is the Antichrist in Muslim apocalyptic literature? The Antichrist is the Jewish Messiah. He's a Jew. He's supported by the Jews. His home base is in Israel and other places. He moves around quite a bit, apparently, and backed by the U.S. Super important to understand that this whole setup of the end times of the Antichrist is based on the idea of the global Zionist conspiracy to rule and dominate the world, of which the Jewish Messiah, the Islamic Antichrist, will be the head and organize the world around him.
I just have to interrupt and say, in other words, if you ever want to talk about like an actual conspiracy theory, the idea that the Jews want to rule the world is complete nonsense. They want a homeland, but this idea that there's some imperialistic power, that's true of China. That is true of Adolf Hitler. He didn't pull it off. That is true of the radical Muslims who want to rule the world under a caliphate. It is not true of the Jews, but the end time scenario put forth by the radical Muslims is that the Jews want to conquer the world, which is why we need to conquer them.
If you've ever seen a map of the Arab world or the Muslim world, and you find Israel identified in the center of it, it's this postage stamp-sized country amidst millions and millions of miles of Muslim land. If the Jews are intent on world domination, they're terribly bad at it.
Or they're being very, very clever and subtle.
Which is what
it almost seems. Yeah. It almost seems funny because it is. It's just. But I mean, the thing is that we have to understand that there are people that the Hamas and the murderous Muslim terrorists genuinely believe the Jews must be exterminated like cockroaches. That every one of them has to be killed because they really want to take over the world, and we've got to make sure they don't. That was Hitler's view, essentially.
Yeah. Now, where did they get that idea? Let's talk about that, if that's all right. Let's go there a bit.
Yeah.
They didn't actually get it from the Quran. And they didn't get it from the hottest, from all the scholars and literature around it, contemporaneous in that time.
Yeah.
So over 1,000 years ago, there was all this writing by scholars around what Muhammad had written in the Quran, and there is very, very little about the end times. There's some outlines, there's some sketches, there's some basic ideas. Even what was there at the time was completely lifted, modeled on the apocalyptic literature of the day, Jewish, Book of Daniel, and Christian, Book of Revelation, and what was available in the 800s.
Did the Muslims get this stuff from? We will hear about that more when we come back talking to Michael Wilkerson. Welcome back, talking to Mike Wilkerson, founder of Stormwall Advisors, host of Stormwall.com, and as I mentioned, author of a tremendous book called Why America Matters, The Case for a New Exceptionalism. So, Mike, you were just talking about where the Muslims got their end time scenario, and you said it's very recently developed.
It is. So if you go back to the epoch of the Quran, around 800 AD, the next century or so, when a lot of scholars filled in the blanks on things that were unclear or just needed clarification, there's very little about the end times. There's the ideas of the final judgment. A lot of it was borrowed from Christian and Jewish apocalyptic literature, Book of Daniel, Book of Revelation.
Borrowed.
In that region, there was a lot of circulation of those ideas.
Yep.
And so Muhammad is known to have had, or believed to have had, debates with Jewish and Christian scholars, clerics, and others. So those basic ideas were laid there. But there wasn't really a whole lot of development on it. That was not the end of the world, was not necessarily a major focus of the Islamic faith.
Yeah.
Something changed in the last 40 or 50 years.
In the last 40 or 50 years.
And this is very important to understand. All right, so I'm going to ask you, do you recall, if you think back in modern Christian history and evangelicalism, there was that era in the 70s and 80s, okay, in which there was all of a sudden this intense focus around the end times, the end of the world, the rapture, Jesus is coming, look busy.
I just wrote about it in the book that I'm coming out with in April, because I remember Hal Lindsey wrote The Late Great Planet Earth. David Wilkerson wrote The Vision. Suddenly there was a lot of this kind of discussion, which, you know, there'd been some before, but it suddenly became a big thing in the 70s.
So what's fascinating, at least to me, maybe not to you, is that there was this resurgence in Muslim apocalyptic literature that followed on from that. And without shame or otherwise, they reference these same names: Tim LaHaye, Hal Lindsey, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, all of these authors, speakers, and otherwise, who were sort of explaining a theology, an eschatology, a study of the end times around it. And it was coincident with the rising conflict in the Middle East, which we'll get into in a moment. But I want to make one point about the outcome of that. I think when we look back at that era in Christendom, we look at it and we say we should always be aware of the end times. Jesus says, always be ready, etc. But it caused a pendulum shift to an extreme where Christians stopped engaging in public life, stopped engaging in the culture, stopped engaging in politics, stopped engaging.
Okay, the idea being that the end is coming, why should I plant a tree?
Right.
The end is coming, why should I plan for my kid's future? Let's get the Slim Jims and the water purification tablets. Let's build a root cellar, and we're going to hunker down and wait.
Terrible idea, very dangerous. We lost a generation.
Unbiblical, harmful.
Okay, so that happens in evangelicalism around that time, or through that generation. Something different. We'll come back into what they actually were talking about, but just imagine that they were the Muslim apocalyptic literature was growing almost on the tailwinds of that. But something different happens. Neither the Christians nor the Muslims looked at this as an opportunity to say, okay, let's build for the future. Let's build giant cathedrals and let's plan for 3 generations. No, they each, Christians exited off stage, hunkered down, as you said. The Muslims, at least the ones who were inspired and radicalized by these views, because this certainly isn't all Muslims, nor is it all Muslim belief, but those who were truly inspired by it were radicalized to action. What do I mean? that I think that there is a latent belief in this part of the Islamic community that by our actions, we can accelerate the coming of Mahdi. We can bring about the circumstances.
Was part of this, I'm old enough to remember in 1979 in Iran when the Shah was deposed and Ayatollah Khomeini, becomes the leader of this Iranian Revolution. That seems to me to have been a big kickoff in everything we're talking about.
You're 100% right. So in a very marked way, that was the first shifting of the season towards this, in the mind of the Muslim apocalyptist.
Yeah.
The beginning of the end. That was the birth pangs. What happened after that? Then you had the U.S. attack on Iraq in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, seizing of the oil fields, which they point to passages in the Quran that say point to this, to the Byzantine barbarians coming for it. Everything that happened in Eastern Europe, Bosnia, Croatia, all that time, 9/11, war on terror, is interpreted as signs of the times bringing us closer to the end of the world, to this capstone moment that you referenced of Armageddon.
Right.
Now, just to back up a little bit, it's important to understand that because the vast majority of the understanding has been adopted or co-opted from Christian or Judaic tradition, what essentially happens here is an inversion, keeping the narrative but inverting it. What do I mean? Let's give an example. You're familiar with Revelation 12, which is this chapter in the book of Revelation, this dramatic image of a woman who represents Israel giving birth to a baby, which represents the Messiah. At the same time, there's this dragon waiting there ready to devour.
Yeah.
And that is Satan and the evil armies and that sort of thing. It's completely inverse in Islam.
Okay, you say it's inverted. You're putting it kindly. Sounds like they twist it and they pervert it. We'll be right back to follow along, talking to Michael Wilkerson. He's the host of Stormwall.com. Hey there, talking to Michael Wilkerson, the host of Stormwall.com. So keep going. You say, and this is to me very telling, that the Muslim interpretation of the end times is basically, sounds like a cannibalization and a twisting of the biblical view of the end times.
Takes the narrative framework, replaces heroes and villains, is the other way to say it. So in that Revelation 12 chapter, the woman is the entire Muslim world, giving birth to the Mahdi, the future leader. The dragon is the Antichrist, is the Jewish state, is the U.S. aligned behind it, as an example of how everything is inverted. And we've talked already about the twisting of the roles of Jesus upon his return of other figures.
You know, what's interesting, as you say this, is it's kind of like when people talk about Gnosticism, it's like the secret knowledge. Like, no, let me tell you the truth. That's what this sounds like. It's kind of like they got the secret, they got the inside knowledge. Like everybody believes this, but no, we know the truth. Obviously, you and I and anybody who's any kind of a Christian believes that the Bible is the Word of God. It's fascinating that they use it, talking about these Muslims, they use it to suit their needs, and they throw out what they don't like. I mean, the idea that Jesus is God, the idea of the Trinity, the idea that he will rule and reign forever and ever. They take what they like, but then the parts they don't like, they spit out. And if you're a Christian, you're obliged to say, I can't accept that. That's not what the Bible says. That's not what the church has taught for 2,000 years.
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting is you look at, again, I want to underscore that a lot of this thinking has really developed and blossomed, which is not the right word for this, but sort of grown like a weed, maybe is the right way to say it, in the last 3 or 4 decades. And so a lot of this thinking has been molded in part to adjust, as we talked about, to the existing narrative framework and then change everything up, but also to adjust to modern circumstances. Now, this we started to talk about Iran. I want to come back to Iran, but what I will say at the same time is a lot of this, the writers, the scholars, the thinkers, the Muslim apocalyptists were in places like Egypt and Saudi. And those governments, Sunni governments, are a bit more moderate, trying to maintain relationships with the U.S., with the West, et cetera, have spent a lot of time over the past 3 or 4 decades trying to suppress this radicalization, because there is now, in a sense, an elite versus popular view. The radicals have captured the popular attention of people who are unemployed, who are struggling under the hands of their governments. And so, not surprisingly, these governments in Saudi, Egypt, elsewhere, arrested, imprisoned, et cetera, these authors, these thinkers around this issue, which, as often happens, only tended to increase their popularity and spur them on. And so now these governments are faced with a real dilemma.
These governments being principally Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
And let's say the other neighboring Sunni governments around
Jordan.
Israel. Jordan, Syria is a bit of a different case.
Okay.
But even the UAE, ones that are, again, trying to somehow walk this fine line between their faith and the relationship with the West and their economies. Iran, following the revolution that you mentioned, has never taken that view. It turns out that the radicals are the ones who are in charge.
Right.
Okay, so in Iran, you have this weird situation where you have sort of 2 heads of government. You have the secular government under Ibrahim Raisi, and then you have the true head, the supreme leader, the cleric, in Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is basically, following his predecessor, declared it is an Islamic state, and as doctrine and policy is the destruction of Israel. So in other words, this view, this apocalyptic view that the Jewish state must be eradicated, that the Antichrist is Jewish, all of these things has made its way into the infrastructure of what is now on the cusp of becoming a nuclear power.
Thank you, Barack Obama. Thank you very much.
So when you look at what's happened since then, you see that through Iran's support of Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and otherwise, that in all of those cases, they are using, take Hamas for example, as cannon fodder, so they don't have to be right in the line of fire. They're proxies for this. But it is official policy, the death and the destruction of Israel. Now, Iran saw something frightening, which is following President Trump's initiatives around the Abraham Accords, to bring in the UAE, to bring in these other nations, and then over the last year, Saudi Arabia, in a approachment and an attempt to reach an agreement on similar terms around an agreement, terrifying to the Shia world, because they see that as getting in bed with the Antichrist, essentially, and would do anything to stop it. And it's pretty clear that they will likely succeed. In other words, the Iranians will likely succeed in stopping the Saudis and others from improving their relationship, because right now, Israel is forced to take a just response to the horrifying terrorist actions that have happened. Israel cannot respond proportionally. Israel has a very small population, a very small place of land. Israel has to respond justly and in order for its own self-defense. However, those actions will further stimulate, provoke, radicalize the Muslim nations around it and make their governments unable, in face of popular revolt and other issues, to continue down a line of rapprochement with Israel.
Wow. That's very helpful analysis. I guess I understood some of that before, but you've clarified it. We've just got a minute left, so keep going.
Well, I think the most important thing, if we only had a minute left and that was it, what I would want to say to you is what Hamas has done is unlocked sort of this ancient dragon of anti-Semitism. You've seen it already in the few weeks. That same spirit that was in Europe and across the world in the mid or early 20th century, which was dormant, largely, is now awake. And you're seeing it in the cities across Europe. You're seeing it here in the U.S. You're seeing it all over the place on social media. There is a bloodlust that has now been reawakened against the Jewish people and against the state of Israel. It's a very dangerous moment.
I mean, I know that deep hatred of the Jews is a spiritual thing. It's demonic. It's demonic. It's a hatred of the God of Israel. It's a hatred of his chosen people. It is real, and it's here again, and we're talking about it with Michael Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back, talking to Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. Mike, I'm going to drag you over into the beginning of hour 2, but for now, just finish up the thoughts that you were discussing a moment ago.
What I mentioned was that the Hamas attack terrorist attack on Israel and its civilians, broke a quiet, wasn't a true peace, but a dormant period where we have now, through that act, Hamas has awakened an ancient dragon, this spirit of anti-Semitism that is represented most vividly in the rise of the Nazi Party, but it was prevalent throughout Europe at the time, prevalent in the U.S. as well, this anti-Semitism that has now, we're seeing it come back to life. We're seeing it in these massive riots, is the right word, in major cities across Europe, where for the last decade or two, mass illegal immigration have let in wave after wave of Maghrebian, Arab Muslims who, like we're seeing on our southern border in the U.S., a lot of young men, a lot of radicalized Muslims, and in fact, throughout Europe and in the U.S., we have allowed a fifth column to infiltrate our society. Hamas's terrorist act was the signal for those forces, that fifth column, to emerge and awaken. And that is in part why you're seeing the riots, why you're seeing these mass
Okay, this I haven't heard. This is very interesting. So you're saying these are connected, that Hamas's just satanic, sadistic cruelty to civilian Jews, folks, sick. You're saying that that was intended to awaken all of these bad actors who are already in all of these countries and who are leading protests.
Yes, and even if I'm wrong and it wasn't intentional, it has happened. This has been the effect and the consequence. They are awakened. They are now, we see it, the media is full of it today. For the Muslim apocalypse, okay, what they believe is that Israel does not belong to the Jews, that God, their God, Allah, brought the Jews back there to get them all in one place so that he could destroy them in the final Armageddon.
Isn't that
is
sweet?
The spirit.
What a wonderful God they worship. That's so sick. I hadn't heard that. So that they really believe that that Allah gathered the Jews into that place so they'd be easier to wipe out. Kind of like putting them in the ghetto in Poland or bringing them in boxcars to, so that they're where we can keep our eye on them and murder them when we feel like it.
Yes, that's exactly right.
I hadn't heard that. That's
terrifying.
That's a new level of sick.
And this is what the secular media will never get. And until they get it, until people understand this, one simply cannot comprehend what is actually happening here. The Hamas attack, this breaking of the peace with Israel, has invited the other nations. They smell the blood in the air, right, or the blood in the water, excuse me, and now they're acting. Perfect example. Prime Minister Erdogan from Turkey has now, rather than taking a measured position, even as a politician on the one hand, on the other hand, no, he's come up very harshly, staunchly supporting Hamas, and a withering attack on Israel and its right to exist and its history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Turkey, which is supposedly the balancing act between East and West, between Constantinople and
well, look,
the East.
This is why NATO is a joke. The idea that you're talking to someone like this, who is, it's just unbelievable to me that the head of Turkey is talking like this, and that anybody's supposed to think of him as other than anti-Western, anti-American. We're at a time right now. We're going to drag you over into hour 2. Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. So in this 10, I want to just talk about, people are saying this is genocide. I keep hearing, that they're. So I just want to kind of talk about what's actually happening there. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right? Yeah. Welcome to Hour 2. Before we go to my next guest, who's the head of Blaze Media, fascinating conversation. I want to continue my conversation with Mike Wilkerson. You can find him at stormwall.com. Mike, we haven't talked about this, but you keep hearing the, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, I don't know what they are. They just seem like BLM wearing different, carrying different flags. You keep hearing them say it's genocide. Cornel West is talking about it's genocide. How is it genocide? In other words, the idea that the Jews would want to be committing genocide seems to me insane, but they keep saying this over and over like this is genocide. They're killing innocents. They're doing this. They're doing that. How do you respond to people who genuinely believe that the Israel Defense Forces are committing genocide in Gaza?
They're lying. They're lying intentionally. They're taking the typical postmodernist critical theory approach and taking the meaning of a word and inverting it and turning it into its opposite meaning. Israel, the Jewish people, are the people at risk of genocide. This century, last century. What I'm trying to say is that we're now, or the blinders have come back off again. We realize that that is still true today as it was 100 years ago. The Muslim world outnumbers Israel something 100 to 1, some massive number. I don't have the population in front of me. We know that Israel doesn't have the land. It doesn't have more than tens of millions of people there. In the U.S., in France, it's the third largest Jewish population in the world. The idea that this is Israel's attempt at a genocide is just preposterous, and it is intentional as a lie to trick and to deceive the people who hear it, because obviously that it is a horrifying word.
And it's used over and over and over again. This is what fascinates me is that really since Biden came into the White House, we have seen a level, I have seen a level of lying and gaslighting like I've never seen in my life. It's one thing for people to have a different narrative, a different perspective. It's one thing for politicians to shade the truth or to promise things they don't do. But this seems genuinely wicked and sick. It's like, you murder my family, and then you say, I was trying to murder your family. And you say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And everybody's like, oh, it's that crazy. You have Jews being butchered so sadistically, so sickly, and instead of talking about that they have flipped it, and that there are people all around the world protesting like Israel is the problem, but they're doing it with such vigor that if you really aren't wise, you would say, well, there must be something to it.
Right. And that deep-seated anti-Semitism, as you said, is a spiritual issue. This isn't a political issue. This isn't something that is just a propaganda. There is something deeply rooted and deeply seated there. We don't have time to go into it, but the Bible basically describes that narrative that the nations of the earth will hate the Israelites, the Jewish people, forever. I find it interesting. I mean, you're familiar with the Jesus' parable of the sheep and the goats, right? So in this parable, he assembles the nations of the world before him and says that those who treated the poor well, treated the prisoner, took care of the prisoners, healed the sick, etc., they would go on one side as the sheep. Those who didn't, those who hurt others, those who mistreated the poor, took advantage of the weak, that they were going on the other side as goats, and that they were going to be subject to eternal punishment. Well, a lot of times that's interpreted as how Jesus will respond to an individual and how he or she lived in life. Well, the parable actually says the nations of the earth. And the point I'm making here is I'm not saying the other isn't true, but I'm saying part of what Jesus was saying here is that the nations will be judged on how they respond to Israel as a nation. Okay? So throughout the Bible, right up through the end time, the Revelation story, we have this classic main event setup of Babylon versus Zion, right? That is the true conflict, and in the end, Babylon is defeated, Zion overcomes. in Islamic literature, apocalyptic literature, it is the modern Babylon who attacks Jerusalem and gets rid of the Jewish Antichrist, et cetera, et cetera. But the point I'm making here is that we are at a moment in time where the nations are going to have to choose how will they respond to what is happening in Israel. And it is a moment of temptation for some of these nations. We already talked about Turkey, but let's talk Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others, who may have been at least willing to engage in some sort of relationship, being forced to reconsider it and making a decision to align with that on the side of Babylon as opposed to on the side of Zion. The U.S. will be forced to make that choice as well. As Israel's staunchest supporter, will that continue, or will we go the way of the goat nations of the world?
Well, I mean, it seems like we're kind of in the middle of that right now, right? In other words, the Biden administration has not been heroically standing with Israel in the way that, George Bush would have, or certainly Donald Trump would have. They're kind of trying to, they're looking around, which way is the wind blowing, what can we get away with? And of course, the radical pro-Palestinian crazy left is protesting the Biden administration for their measured response. In other words, their response is too measured for those guys. Those guys want them to condemn Israel.
Condemn Israel and basically give up their right of sovereignty and the right to defend themselves.
Yeah.
I'm not happy with what the Biden administration has been pushing for, though. There's no such thing as a humanitarian pause in a situation like this.
Well, that's what I'm saying. This is like more idiocy. Yeah. Humanitarian pause. Like how this is called a war. This is a war. And the idea that Israel doesn't care about civilians, look, that's a wicked lie. Israel, like the United States, goes far out of its way to care for civilians to the greatest extent possible. I don't see other nations doing that. But even that is not acknowledged.
No. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was Iran and how, going all the way back to the Obama era, how the nuclear agreement that was entered into really undermined the security of Israel, undermined the security of the U.S., frankly. And President Trump put an end to that. But even though they weren't complying with the terms of the JCPOA, as it was called at the time, that nuclear agreement, the Obama administration gave them, I believe it was $12.7 billion, plus several hundred million of economic sanctions relief for at least coming to the table. Well, that was ridiculous. Right. We basically fed our enemies with the fuel that they would need to turn around and attack Israel. We have to get back to more of a Trump-like approach to Iran. Circumstances have changed somewhat, but the general idea and the Biden administration's desire to try to appease Iran, send them $6 billion more, whether we actually sent it or not, or didn't get there, I'm not sure. But the intention, the approach to Iran is completely wrong.
Well, the naivete of the left toward evil has always been astonishing and unbelievably destructive. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. I mean, you had that with the former Soviet Union. Today, you have it in spades with Obama and Biden's approach to Iran. They don't seem to understand the situation at all, and seem to be, as you say, feeding the enemies of the United States and Israel. 60 seconds left. Some final thoughts, my friend.
Well, I think maybe to just close out the geopolitical point, one of the things I've been talking about all year long is that we are stepping away now from the specific issue around Israel. We are in a distinct point in history. We are at a tipping point, and it is a point of the shifting geopolitical landscape that the old lines are being redrawn, and this creates significant danger for America, for Europe, and otherwise. Again, a lot of the policies of the Biden administration has worsened this, for example, by pushing Russia, a European and Christian nation, into the hands of the Chinese and not giving them any way out, cornering them with that as their only option.
Yeah.
We've lost a neutral in a future conflict, or at least an ally or a neutral, et cetera. These shifts that we're seeing now are going to continue. This is the moment we're in.
Mike Wilkerson, thank you, folks. Go to stormwall.com.